So let's continue on. Frowe, The Ethics of War and Peace, an introduction. Oh, forgot to write that up there. We're in chapter 2, still in chapter 2, and the second video on this chapter. Again, this chapter is shall we say, a very high level abstract look at the relationship between war and self-defense. I started off in the first video by explaining and looking at the two very high level positions, which aren't really that deeply implicated in this book, but nonetheless, I think Frowe does a good job of bringing them out and talking about them. And you should be thinking about these as you reason your way around all the complexities that moral complexities, that is, that war raises. So we've seen this, that war can be seen either in a collectivist or an individualist sense. War is something new. The domestic analogy collapses. It's this kind of special political type of activity. And the problem that, as we've seen, well, why is it this political activity, causes or engenders this need for a new morality? So the political ends, after all, of a state can be good, bad, just like political ends of individuals. So what's with this, as McMahon likes to say, and I think it's a great kind of thing to quote, what's with this moral alchemy? You can make this claim kind of stick, like, so, you got to defend this. Well, the response, and again, I'm just sort of raising what the debate is about, is the nature of political self-determination. Is that something different when a nation is doing its own political self-determination? Maybe, it's democratically elected or not. Does this really matter? And the collectivists are making the claim that, yes, this is a different game when this is involved as opposed when individuals go about it. So does that really answer the charge of moral alchemy? I don't know. It's not clear, but that's where the crux of the debate, I think, arguably is on this one, is really, is there something new here when you start talking about collective activities? Because we tend to look at them in general. There's a history of seeing them as different. And again, as I said previously, that is in the previous video, that this has largely been the kind of angle of international law. Now, let's look at the other one, the individualist one. War is nothing new. The domestic analogy holds. And so since there's nothing new here, we can use the same kinds of ideas and thoughts that we've had on of civil society. We can use them with respect to war as well. So the collective state and all that doesn't really introduce anything new. Well, the response to that, and Frowe goes into all these details, but basically is a kind of indirect proof, which says something like this. It comes from logic that if you want to refute something, you assume it, whatever X, you're assuming a position, you're trying to refute X, you assume it and then derive some kind of absurdity or something unacceptable, which is this little symbol here for absurdity, which is kind of an upside down T. But of course we reject T, and then by a certain, transformation rule in logic, we would then reject X. It's kind of like when you say to a friend, well, if you believe that, then you're going to have to be committed to this, and this is unacceptable, so you really shouldn't believe that. We use this kind of indirect reasoning all the time in coffee shops around the world. Now, how does that work here? Well, if you say something like this, you're using an indirect kind of argument. Okay, but if you assume that individualism is correct, like if I'm going to assume that, then, the Geneva Convention is going to collapse. It's going to be in trouble. It's going to be, very questionable, right? Because the Geneva Convention really assumes that, you shouldn't be punishing soldiers that fight for either side, right? Well, you'll get a kind of victor's justice, that the one that wins the war is the right side in the end, because they can then start, prosecuting soldiers. You could get, counterfactuals. Had the Nazis won the war? You hear this. Oh, well, had the Nazis won the war, the Nuremberg trials would have been held and it would have been very different. They'd have been prosecuting the Allies. And if you have individualism, then you could have had, Nazi lawyers and whatever prosecuting individual soldiers, saying they're just as guilty as anybody, right? So the whole side is completely guilty right from the upper echelons and right down to the ordinary soldiers on the battlefield. Right, so individualism, there's no distinction anymore. So the Geneva Convention would kind of collapse. Now, Victor's justice, I gave it, first the real hardcore spin in terms of, you get this sort of, the Nazis in charge. But even on the other side, if you would, quote unquote, if you get, sort of the good guys, if you want to use that sort of, in a very loose sense, even if we think that the side that won is the right side to have won, the morally good side, even if we do accept that, Victor's justice would then go overboard and say that you would be going after, individual German soldiers that were conscripted and saying they're just as guilty as anybody else on that side. So in that sense, you would have an overreach, we would say, an overreach of the law, right? So this individualism causes all kinds of problems, and it really destroys this notion that's been set up by the Geneva Convention. So you get a victor's justice, which is a kind of a revenge sort of notion, and that's not really justice. So what's the response to that? Well, the response is that you have this notion of a two-tier response, that you have, well, okay, the laws of war will keep that, but the deep morality of war is individualist. So the laws of war might be collectivist, we'll keep that, because those are pragmatic, right? So the law is a human thing, it's pragmatic, but the deep morality of war, that doesn't have a purpose. That's just, as McMahon says, morality just is what it is. And in that sense, they would still be looking at war individuals. Yeah, they're all guilty on that side, but we may not prosecute because it's not pragmatic to do so. Well, that's then, is this going to work? Is this practical or whatnot? And of course, then the charge is, well, now you've got a metaphysics over here with the deep morality of war. Where does that come from? Et cetera, et cetera. So once you start splitting and making distinctions, here they're charged, there's moral alchemy over here, but here there's sort of a dogmatic metaphysics that's underlying it. So, I don't know, maybe the moral of the story is you can't get away from some kind of non-empirical kind of approach, or bringing non-empirical or ideal concepts in where you say, well, that's, something new is happening, or there's something metaphysical that has to be brought in, or whatnot. But that gives you sort of a general framework as, there is the problem, then the response, and then the argument is over the response. Problem, response, argument over the response. All right, so that gives you a very high-level abstract overview. But the takeaway, as Frowe points out repeatedly, is that this might be all done at a very high abstract level. But as you can see, it's going to have ramifications, because when you start talking about, jus in bello, how you understand that is going to be deeply influenced by how you understand this thing way back here as a concept. How does it relate to self-defense? And what exactly is war anyways? This doesn't settle any of the problems, but it just shows that there's a lot of background discussion, agreement, disagreement before you even get to the problems really on the battlefield. But the book essentially is more concerned with jus in bello rather than jus ad bellum. Nonetheless, there will be some discussion coming up in future videos about what jus ad bellum is all about. In any case, stay tuned.